History isn't written in blood. It's written in ink, by men with clean fingernails, by men who went home to kiss their daughters after signing the death warrants of 10,000 strangers. In 1961, the world waited to see a monster. They expected a beast with fangs, a creature vibrating with hatred. Instead, they got Adolf Eichmann. He was terrifyingly ordinary. He didn't hate Jews. He just loved his job. This is the banality of evil, but the reality is much darker than a catchy phrase. Welcome to Psyche of Power. Today, we aren't looking at what the Nazis did. We are looking at what they became. And why, under the right conditions, you would have done the same. This is the anatomy of obedience, a deep dive into the psychological surrender of the Third Reich. Forget the madness of the crowds. Madness is easy to dismiss. We need to talk about the sanity of the executioner. The distance between these two men isn't a moral chasm. It's a series of psychological levers. Why did an entire civilization choose to stop thinking? Why does the human mind find comfort in the boot of authority? Let's strip back the skin of history. Act 1: The Agentic Shift. The moment you stop being a person and start being a tool. You've heard of Stanley Milgram, but you haven't heard of the agentic state, the specific cognitive bypass that turns a moral human into a lethal cog. Milgram didn't prove we are evil. He proved that when we are under orders, our sense of responsibility doesn't disappear. It shifts upward to the authority figure. In Nazi Germany, this was the national default. The soldier didn't kill, the order killed. The soldier was merely the delivery system. This is the first cognitive reversal. Obedience isn't a choice you make. It's a psychological relief you accept to escape the weight of your own conscience. We call it administrative evil, a term coined by Danny Balfour. It occurs when evil is masked by technical competence. When you turn a human being into a data point, the empathy centers of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, simply stay dark. Look at the symmetry. The Nazis weren't just obsessed with race. They were obsessed with order. To the psychological mind, order is a potent drug. It cures the anxiety of a chaotic world. The Third Reich offered a total meaning. For a German in 1933, the Nazi Party wasn't a political choice. It was a psychological shelter from the storm of the Great Depression and the humiliation of Versailles. But how do you get a good man to do bad things? You don't ask him to do it all at once. You use foot in the door conditioning. It starts with a salute, then a small donation, then a badge. By the time the gun is in your hand, your identity has been swallowed. This is the first 3-minute reversal. The Nazis didn't destroy German morality. They redefined it. It became immoral to disobey. They used the paternal archetype. Hitler wasn't just a leader. He was the national father. And you don't argue with father. Look at these faces. This is the ordinary men phenomenon, as documented by historian Christopher Browning. These men in Police Battalion 101 weren't ideological fanatics. They were middle-aged draftsmen and merchants. When given the chance to step out, most did. Why? Not because they feared the firing squad. They feared the judgment of their peers. This is the social identity theory by Henry Tajfel. The fear of being the out group is more powerful than the fear of committing murder. To leave the line was to admit you were too weak for the necessary work. Masculinity was weaponized. Each man was a gear. If a gear stops, it's broken. And in a totalitarian state, broken things are discarded. Act 2: Identification with the aggressor. The ultimate psychological survival hack. Anna Freud, daughter of Sigmund, identified a defense mechanism that explains the love for the dictator. When a victim is faced with an inescapable, overwhelming power, the mind does something radical. It adopts the traits of the oppressor to survive. By becoming the aggressor, you are no longer the victim. You share in his power. You feel his strength. The Nazis didn't use hate as their primary tool. They used disgust. There is a massive difference in the brain. Hate is hot. It's an active emotion. Disgust is cold. It's about purity. This is the behavioral immune system theory. They framed the Holocaust not as a war, but as public health. This is the biopolitics of the Reich. You don't hate a cancer cell. You just remove it. This psychological distancing allowed the executors to remain civilized in their own minds. Think about that. The greatest horror in history was driven by a desire for cleanliness. This leads us to the Lucifer effect. Philip Zimbardo's less discussed concept of administrative evil. When you change the language, you change the morality. They didn't say killing. They said special treatment. They said repatriation. George Orwell called it newspeak, but psychologically, it's euphemistic labeling. It bypasses the moral filters of the brain. The Nazis were the first to pass major animal welfare laws. They loved nature. They hated cruelty to dogs. This is moral compartmentalization. The human brain can hold two contradictory worlds in its hands as long as they never touch. The wall isn't made of stone. It's made of cognitive dissonance. To resolve the dissonance, you don't stop the act. You change the narrative. The law becomes the ultimate moral justification. Positivist law, the idea that there is no law higher than the states. The death of the natural law within the soul. In the Reich, the eye of the Führer replaced the eye of God. It was a secular religion, with its own saints, its own rituals, and its own hell. Act 3. The banality of the self. Why the Nazi ghost still haunts your DNA. We like to think we are different. We like to think we would have been the hero, the rebel, the one who said no. Statistical reality says you wouldn't have. You would have been the one who looked the other way, or the one who typed the lists. The agentic shift is a survival mechanism. Our brains are hardwired to defer to perceived expertise and authority to reduce cognitive load. Uncertainty is the greatest psychological pain. A dictator provides certainty. Even a violent certainty is more comfortable than a free chaos. After the war, the defense was always Befehl ist Befehl. An order is an order. We call this diffusion of responsibility. If everyone is responsible, no one is. The blame was passed up the chain until it reached a dead man in a bunker. And then it vanished. This is the clean Wehrmacht myth. The idea that the regular soldiers were just doing their job while the SS did the dirty work. Psychology tells us that moral cleansing rituals, like blaming a scapegoat, don't actually work. They just prepare the mind for the next cycle. It was the first time modern industrial management was applied to mass murder. It was evil at scale. When you turn death into a production goal, you remove the soul from the crime. Think about your own job. Do you know the full impact of every submit button you click, every policy you follow? This is the ghost in the machine. The detachment of the bureaucrat is the modern equivalent of the agentic state. The tools change. The psychology remains. Zimbardo's Lucifer effect proved that even without a Hitler, good boys from Stanford could become sadistic guards in 72 hours. All it takes is a role and a system. Policy always outweighs empathy in a hierarchy. That is the design of the hierarchy. Arendt realized that the greatest evil is committed by those who fail to think. Not thinking doesn't mean being stupid. It means refusing to reflect on the meaning of your actions. It is the most common sentence in the history of human atrocity. Each pair of shoes was a person. Each person was ended by someone who thought they were doing the right thing for the greater good. So, where is the hope? If we are all capable of this, how do we stop it? The power of the dissenter. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments showed that it only takes one person to break the spell. When one person refuses to obey, the agentic state of the entire group begins to crumble. You have to calibrate your compass before the storm hits. Once you are in the shift, it's too late. They knew the cost. They chose the natural law over the statutory evil. They were executed, but they remained human. The Third Reich is gone, but the psychological pathways they exploited are still there, in your brain, in mine. Authority is a contract. You sign it every day. You don't question the order. The next time you are told to just do your job, remember Adolf Eichmann. He was a very good employee. Understand the power of your own psyche before someone else uses it for you. I'm Psyche of Power. Stay sharp, stay human. Subscribe to keep your soul